Welcome to Decision Space, the only show that takes place right here, in the space between the turns of your favorite games. I'm Pete Wissinger,
I'm Jared Ingersoll.
I'm Analog Arnie.
and this is the podcast about decisions in games. And we have a doozy of a special episode here. First of all, I want to talk about my guests I have here. First, I've got now, I think, fifth time returning guest, Jared Ingersoll. Is that right?
I believe so. Is this like SNL? Do I get a jacket or
Yeah,
something?
yeah, right. Five Timers Club. Congratulations. So Jared has previously joined us for episodes about Reiner Knizia, about games of the 90s, and possibly more importantly, as my co-pilot for a deep dive on arcs earlier this year. We'll get back to that. Jared, thanks for joining again. Always a pleasure.
Happy to be here.
And then a very special guest we have for the first time on Decision Space, YouTube celebrity Analog Arnie, our first ever Muppet guest. Arnie, thanks for joining for Decision Space.
Glad to be here. I think celebrity's a little strong, but I'll take it. I can't really blush, so sure, why not?
I highly recommend people check out Arnie's YouTube channel. I will put a link in the show notes. Arnie makes some of my favorite board game reviews on YouTube, and it's a real delight to have you. So thanks, Arnie.
That's too much. But I do want to plug that I'm working hard on the Blighted Reach video. I'm very excited about it. It's gonna be my longest video yet. So this is kind of my precursor to that.
This is
Although
the prelude,
the
right?
pre exactly. Exactly. Spending all my resources getting it done.
Okay, so before we jump into the topic of the day, I just want to let the listeners know that Decision Space could be, this is a for your consideration, your choice for podcast of the year on the Golden Geeks. Every year, BGG does a user voted awards kind of system called the Golden Geek, and they're currently accepting nominations. So if you go to Board Game Geek, you can vote for like your favorite games of 2025. But one of the categories is favorite board game podcast, and we would really, really, really appreciate a nomination for Decision Space for best podcast. So go to BGG, check it out. Thank you so much. Now, on to the main event. The reason I have Jared and Arnie with me is these are the two people I know who are the biggest experts, or at least most experienced players in my social circle of Arcs, the Blighted Reach. So in episode 247, Jared and I deep dive Arcs, and I highly recommend, if you did not listen to that episode, that you listen to episode 247 before joining us back here. Go on and do that right now. We'll be here when you get back. Okay, thanks for rejoining. Um, what we're talking about today is this giant monstrosity that is Arcs the Blighted Reach, which is a three-act campaign expansion for Arcs. And actually, I believe Arcs, from its initial inception, was envisioned to be a three-act campaign game. And that actually what we know of as the Arcs base game sort of came later in a weird way. Um, and this is one of the most ambitious tabletop like products that I have ever experienced in my life.
100%. Couldn't agree more. And I think it's funny that the profile of the box is 4 times as big, and just when you're shopping for that game and this is listed as an expansion, it's just kind of ridiculous.
And I think it was really smart for them to make this an expansion because I think that this is gonna be too much for some people, and there's so much to enjoy in the Arcs system as a more accessible single session game, maybe the most accessible game Cole Wehrle has ever designed. But there's nothing quite like taking the deep dive into the Blighted Reach. Now, before we talk about what this expansion is, I want to talk to you all about your experience with this campaign system because this is essentially a way to string 3 full games of arcs together into one 3-act campaign. I have played at this point when we Jared, you maybe remember when we recorded episode 247, I had completed 1 arcs campaign. I have now completed 4 arcs campaigns in the so I've been doing my homework. Now, Jared, how many campaigns, full 3-act campaigns have you completed?
5. I've completed 5 full campaigns, 3 of which were 4 players, 2 3-player campaigns.
Yeah, so for me, I did 1 4-player, 1 3-player, and 2 2-player campaigns. Arnie, where are you at? Do you know your stats?
I am not a stats person. I don't like track stuff. I'm more about the soul, that's kind of my jam. But I think I'm upwards of 15 full campaigns by now.
M
A lot of those are two-player, some of those didn't finish, so I'm not I don't remember which ones I'm supposed to be counting and which I haven't, so but that's where I'm at. And
that
honestly, I know a lot of people that quite a bit more. So I don't know, for a board game, that's quite a bit though.
15 is crazy, though. We're talking many, many hours of Arc's Blighted Reach. So we didn't get your impression on the base game because you weren't on episode 247, but Arnie, do you prefer campaign arcs to base arcs?
So honestly, 100%. I
Okay.
played one game of base arcs, and then the
Wow.
next game was the Blighted Breach. Now I've played, and I don't recommend that by the way. I've played a bunch of base games since then, and I really like base game. But base game is kind of like exercise for the Blighted Reach for me. So and I'm really excited for the stuff they're gonna add. In the expansion later, they'll, spice up the base game, but we're not here for that. So
That's absolutely, wild. Playing only 1 game of base before jumping into the campaign, you know, the thing is, and we're gonna talk about this, I think of Ark's Blighted Reach as almost a full new game's rules added on top of the rules of Ark's base game. Like, it takes what I think is a pretty tight and, streamlined system and turns it into something that is gigantic. Maybe I'm off. Jared, what do you think?
It is definitely quite a bit more involved, but personally, I think it's somewhat overstated. I feel like most hobbyist gamers, like if you've played Twilight Imperium, if you've played other games of a comparable weight, like it is certainly attainable. Like the game does recommend that you start out and you work your way up to it, but I feel like if your expectations are in check and you know that there's going to be some mistakes and some learning, like you can go into it.
But, like, saying that Twilight Imperium is in a similar weight is saying something.
Yes.
Like, we have upgraded our ambitions.
Yes. And but yeah, compared to Root and Oath, like the campaign is a few notches above.
interesting.
Yeah,
I
and it's
actually feel
actually
like oh, sorry. Go
no,
ahead.
go on.
I actually feel like it's almost a combination, and that's what makes it more difficult. But actually, I found learning Oath more difficult originally because you kind of don't have a direction. At least in here, you have a direction. And same thing with Root. There is a lot of asymmetry in the Blighted Reach, but at the end of the day, you're not totally asymmetric. You're still playing arcs, and so there. But all of those things combined still makes it a hard to parse game. But overall, I'm really glad that the base game exists because for me, it made it stepping into it easier. Even though I only played one game first, it still I
So
learned some games online, by myself beforehand. But yeah, I'm that kind of guy.
well, I
That's
I I think what my goal here is gonna be is I'm gonna first give just, like, a general overview for our audience as to what is added to ARCs. So just say, like, what are the sort of special rules for the campaign and give an overview, and then we are going to essentially deep dive the decision space of each act of an ARCS campaign, as much as we can, because of course every campaign you play is going to be very different. But let's start by just saying what is the Blighted Reach. Okay, so what we have here basically is it's like you're playing ARCS. If you've ever played ARCS with like the leaders are sort of stand in for what the campaign calls a fate. And a fate is your storyline for your character. And there's 3 sets of fates. There's A, B, and C fates. The A fates you could play all the way through if you're successful. Play them in the first, second, and third act of the campaign. The B fates are ones you can pick up in Act 2, and the C fates are ones you could pick up in Act 3. But the unique thing about this is that essentially the game state at the end of a game of ARCs is the beginning state for the next act. So you can sit down, as I know Jared likes to do, and play the whole campaign in one, like, what, 7-hour session? I don't know. How long does a one session sit down of this take?
Or like 10.
Oh, okay.
It is a marathon.
I've only Yeah, I've only done it in 1 and 2 evening chunks. I've never done a single sit down. Arnie, have you ever done, all in one go?
No, no way. And that's one thing I think that, it has a benefit over Twilight Imperium. I like Twilight Imperium, but yeah. Nope. As a stay-at-home dad, if this wasn't split up, I it wouldn't be a game for me. So,
Fair enough. So it's kind of interesting to compare this to Oath because Oath is a game that sort of the ending of one game dictates the setup for the next, but this kind of takes that to another level. So some of the things that are different is there are pieces on the board now that don't belong to any particular players. There is a whole bunch of this stuff called Blight on the board, which is kind of like uh, like a PvE instead of PvP element. You can attack this Blight and take it as trophies. There's also pieces belonging to an empire. And in the story of this game, we are all regents of a dying empire. And there's these big purple ships that represent the empire we all belong to. There's also some neutral stuff on the board, some neutral cities. And then some of the big things that happen is that there are now events that take place. There's now something called edicts, which are like extra rules for the game that we keep adding to as the campaign goes on. So we're essentially like creating new rules for the whole table to follow. There's something called a crisis that can happen, which makes the blight attack players and also makes events trigger off cards in either the court or in people's tableau. And then lastly, there is like a summit phase where players can actually do some negotiation and that's kind of like the stuff that's added. And so playing a fate means that instead of just getting worrying about like ambitions you would declare in a game of arcs, you have your own personalized objectives that you're trying to complete to advance your story. And so that's actually I think the biggest change in the Blighter Reach campaign is it becomes a little bit less zero sum. Instead of all of us just like fighting to get power from ambitions, we kind of each drift off and tell our own stories in the shared board state and ambition declaration of a game of arcs, and that asymmetry just builds as you go. And as people enter fates and exit fates, it's just like a whole bunch of asymmetry smashing together to tell, I think, a really cool story, except that there is no paragraph you read in this. It's funny, this is a story based game, but you're not reading any narrative. You're telling a story. When you pick a fate, you get maybe 1 or 2 sentences that tell you what your story is. Just like, for example, I'll just read if you are the steward in Act One, which is an A fate, the only story you are told is hold together a fragmenting empire while navigating fractious court politics. And that's it. But that gives you context for all these cards that end up in your court and what your objectives are. And the story is immersive, but it's a story that reveals itself through gameplay rather than through reading. So
The
that's kind of
fates
like
are the primary engine for the decisions in this game. It's the biggest point of difference, and it adds more layers to the choices you're going to be making throughout. Because Arcs is still a highly tactical game for your choices that you're making, but now there are long-term ramifications over the course of these 3 acts.
yeah, for sure. And like there's an element that like you have objectives and everyone has objectives they're trying to get to, but um if you fail your objective, your story lives on. You know, Cole really has talked about how he's trying to mimic like science fiction storytelling. So many sci-fi stories are these 3-act stories and like sometimes you fail and your story changes and you get and you're still like continuing on this story, but it may have taken a twist that you didn't expect. And the fates are kind of everything, but all that stuff I said, like completing your fate's objective, it's on top of and still kind of tied to all the rules and strategy of playing a game of arcs, you know, the trick taking action selection system, the ambition declaration, that's there. But everything else is coming from this new imperial blight kind of stuff that's added. So, should we jump into the decision space of the blighted reach?
Are we gonna take it act by act, or how we doing this?
Let's go act by act, I think. Let's talk about sort of what it's like to play a first act of an ARCS campaign and what that decision space is like. Okay. So, the first thing that happens, act 1, here we go. The title scroll is going across the screen, right? We're in act 1 of ARCS the Blighted Reach. So the first thing you do is you're given 2 of these fate cards and you pick one, right? And that will dictate your story for act 1. You get 2 A fates. Uh Arnie, let's how do you go about like making that decision? Like, well, what is that like? That because you're kind of going in blind, right?
Oh man, I think I might be the wrong person to ask that because I've got a lot of opinions on like maybe you should pass this to Jared first.
All
But
right,
I
Jared,
can
you kick
answer
it.
it if you want to, but
No, no, we'll come back to
we're
you, Arnie.
okay.
So, my choices throughout have been, trying all the different fates at this point. So, I've
Okay.
in 5 games, I've chosen 5 different act act 1 going through. So, I have played as the caretaker, the partisan, the magnet, the believer, and the admiral. And then I have played against the remaining 3. So I have seen all of the A's in action, and
So
I
what that
will.
means, Jared, is that when you're picking a fate, you're picking for an experience, right? Is that kind of
Yes.
what you're going for?
Yes. I want to push the buttons, pull the levers, and see how they interact because each one is quite disruptive, and you need to go around because they'll add new facets to the game that you will need to work around. And for me, a lot of the joy comes from seeing the different fates interact with one another, which is why I prefer 4 players for just maximum chaos and the different points of intersection. So at this point, I am, yes, going off of vibes, right? I look at them and which one have I not tried and go through there. In the future, after I've explored all of them, it will probably still be vibes.
And it's funny how much you vibe you get from these cards. It's like a single image and a single line of text, and it really does just like be like, "Ooh, I wanna know what it's like to play as this." Now, Arnie, you've played enough of these campaigns that you maybe are starting to think competitively about the Fate draft. Is that true?
100%. And it's only two fates, right? So you can't like galaxy brain it at this stage. But I am 100% thinking of the whole game together. And essentially, what you're doing by choosing a fate in the very beginning is saying, what mechanic am I putting forth into the argument? Because each fate, the magnate, if I'm picking them, I'm saying that resources are going to be the thing that matters in this game. And the admiral, the Empire ships and where they are and what they're doing, that's going to be his jam. So you only get two choices, so it's not Galaxy Brain yet. But I'm choosing based on, the things that I like, but also what I want or am trying to want matter at the end of the game.
That's a really good observation because, yeah, like you said, essentially each of these fates is taking a piece of base game arcs and cranking it in some way. So, like for example, my first campaign I played as the partisan, and the partisans' whole thing is they change the way that seizing ambitions works, which seizing the initiative, I mean. And, like, seizing the initiative is, like, one of my favorite things to do in arcs, and normally the way you seize the initiative in arcs is that you have to discard a card and say, "No, I'm leading the next trick." But the partisan does this thing where you essentially provoke outrage, which is something you normally would probably avoid doing in a game of arcs, but that's how you seize the initiative. And so, you know, maybe to what you're saying, Arnie, it's like, do I feel like playing the outrage game? Do is that something I'm comfortable with kind of totally throwing off for the rest of these 3 acts? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, pretty much. It's pretty limited to those first two choices. So it's basically just which mechanic do I want to play with this, you know, not just this act, but for the whole campaign. Because even if you fail, a lot of it will stick around, depending on the fate.
Yeah, like one of the fates is the caretaker who has these little like spherical
Columns.
golems, yeah, around the board, and even if the caretaker goes away, those golems hang around, right? Like that's now in the game. Or I've never actually played with the believer, but I know the believer adds new cards to the deck, right? Jared, have you played believer?
Yes. The Believer is probably the most impactful of the A fates, but it is also, in my experience, the most difficult to achieve their objectives. So it adds a new suit of cards, which is double sided. So you can choose between when you play it, it's not both playing that card, it is which way you play it. And then it gives you the same actions, just a different subset. And your main thing is adding those cards, seeding them into the deck, and then that will carry over through the entire rest of the campaign.
Now, I believe that everyone reveals their choices simultaneously, right? And so, sometimes you may be like, okay, I think I'm gonna go for this fate. And then you see what everyone else picks, and you're like, oh God, no. Like, because what other people pick matters as well, right?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So, pointing out the believer, it's very interesting because it is difficult. Some, really skilled people can pull it off. I've only gotten to do it once, but in the same respects as Root, the lizard cult, is maybe not the easiest faction to win with. And so there's, maybe what some people would call imbalance. I call it fun because, and if I'm picking the believer, I'm going up for a challenge this time. And on the same, tact, if I pick the believer and the advocates in the game, they also deal with the court and cause problems for the believer. And so then, as soon as that happens and I see that flop, I know that this has got to be a negotiation heavy game. I've got to beg, I've got to cry, I've got to make people like me, whatever means necessary, or else I'm going to fail. Which, failing isn't failing isn't the worst thing in the world, but you get some negative points and you have to switch. So, sometimes you hit the decision point where, you need to give up on your fate and move on. But super fun imbalance, I think.
Agreed. And as to your point earlier, the other fates, they interact with each other in different ways. So, and some of them are more closely aligned because, as Pete mentioned, everyone starts out as a regent, and so a member of the imperial court, but you have the option to become an outlaw. And there are some fates, such as the admiral. and the steward who are really incentivized to have a strong empire and keep that going. So if they are both in there and they are aligned in some tactical ways, and then there are others who are incentivized to become outlaws and to raid there. And so it can depend on the different combinations as to what the shape of the galaxy will look like.
Oh my gosh, I've been in games where like, I find it, like, annoying as the admiral when the steward is in the game because it's like, "Oh, I wanna be in charge of the empire," right? So it's like it's funny, it's almost like if you've ever played Oath, if there's, like, multiple citizens that are, like, bickering over sort of like, we're on the same team, but, like, I kinda needed to be doing my kind of thing, and that's actually being on the same team is kind of funny because one of the big, I think, decision space changes that you immediately notice in playing Act 1 of Arcs versus playing base Arcs is that I don't know about you, but to me, it feels a little bit friendlier. In fact, if you're all regents and the Imperial ships are present in the same system as you, you literally can't attack each other. Like, this is a game where at the start of it, it's actually difficult to directly hurt another player in a way that like stealing things or whatever because if the imperial ships are in the system watching over you and you're all regions you actually can't fight each other so you have this way where like it's like okay I have my goals and you have your goals and I actually don't mind if you achieve your goals maybe because maybe I'd rather you be an A fate in act 2 than bring in a B fate right and so Arnie, you just shook your head at me. You don't agree that Act 1 of an Arcs campaign is a bit friendlier than just playing base Arcs?
I mean, it's naturally friendlier, right? You're not all competing for the straight up same things. But I find that as you get more and more familiar with the fates and see how they interact and how they interact in the future, if they fail or not. So I'll give you an example. So let's bring up the admiral again and the steward. Both of them kind of don't like each other. They're kind of stepping on each other's toes, but neither of them should want the other one to fail in Act 1. The reason why is because if either of them fails, they will put court cards um, in the deck that will cause either everybody to leave the Empire, which would be bad for the Admiral, or I can't remember the other one. I think it's Empire ships turn outlaw. Anyway, they're bad for the Empire. And so they kind of have to be friends, or at least that's the decision space that they need to decide on, and whether that's worth the risk or not in the second act. And so it becomes more of a dance and more of a struggle. So, yes, it's technically nicer, but it's also kind of mm, passive aggressive, I guess. And there's all kinds of little interactions between all the fates that way. And so over time, you want this certain fate to fail if you're going to succeed, and, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have, like I said, felt that sort of frenemy relationship when I've seen Steward and Admiral both in a game. But that kind of makes me think, and here's something I need you all to weigh in on, having played more campaigns than me. One thing you immediately are confronted with in an Act 1 of Arcs is the game will ask you, would you like to call a summit? So there's these cards that are added to the trick taking deck, which are event cards, and whoever wins the trick, whoever is has the initiative, will decide whether or not they would like to call for a summit, which brings a new system to the game where you can actually negotiate. You can like trade pieces. You can say, "Hey, can you trade one of your ships for one of my ships? I'll give you this court card or this resource." That the game actually just opens up and is like, you can swap stuff around if you want. And I think it's an overwhelming choice the first time you play if you're used to playing base arcs and you're like, "Well, why would I give them a resource? I want that resource." How do you all approach a summit? Because it's something I feel like I'm still kind of figuring out how to navigate. Jared, do you wanna talk about summits a little bit?
In my experience, summits are important for the people who have favors. So in the campaign, favors is represented by having agent, an opponent's agent on your fate card, and that means there's a certain amount of things that are up for negotiation, like Pete mentioned, pieces and locations on cards, and as well as your trophies and captives. And a favor, if you have a favor, you can cash it in to take one of those things with some constraints. So I have not seen a whole lot of successful negotiation outside of someone calling in a favor and making it done so. When it does happen, it comes to your objectives, right? Because we can I don't know how much we've emphasized this, but each act you are still trying to get the most points through power, and then at the end of an act, you l- you go down to half, and then at the end of the third act, it's whoever has the most power will win. So you are still trying to get points, and objectives are in there. And as Arnie mentioned earlier, failing objective will make you lose some of those points. And so you are heavily incentivized to complete your objective. And so there have been circumstances where, in order to meet my objective, this is more important to me than these would be in other ways. So I am willing to negotiate to means to that end. That has been my experience.
Ar Arnie, bring us to the negotiating table. What's with this summit thing?
Oh man, I gotta tell you that that is one of the most annoying things when playing with new players,
Right.
that they just won't negotiate. And that there's a pretty obvious reason why, is because they're like, I don't know why I would want to help you. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know what the consequences of helping you means. And so they just don't. And they're just like, "Nah. I don't want to see you, get whatever you need to move on." And when playing with players that know the ramifications, I feel like they're much more willing to just be like, "Oh yeah." And even sometimes, it almost becomes like a corrupt level where two players are working together. I had a game with the steward and the believer who were way too friendly and helping each other succeed, and it was almost disgusting, you know. And the cooperation, can feel that way sometimes. And so I don't know, new players, I see why it's not something that they jump on initially because it's foreign, and it's also like they're used to the zero sum thing,
Right.
and it's
It
they don't want to give anything away.
Yeah, and I think it's a little opaque, the actual negotiation, like when and why you would do it. It's only gonna come from experience, and I also wanna note here, another difference in an Act 1 game of Arcs compared to playing base game is you only play 3 chapters. Right? It's shorter, it's 3 hands, and then it's over, and so that actually it still takes about the same amount of time because of these events and negotiations. Also, someone is going to be the first regent, that's like the main person, like, the Empire's favored, regent, and the first regent gets to essentially enact laws every time there's an event. Well, I guess it's either gonna be edicts, which are these governing laws, or it's going to be a crisis. But they can like force other players to add resources and stuff to the imperial treasury, and then those count as yours when it comes to ambitions. And that also, you know, one thing you can do if you kind of like seize on the summit phase by there's a card you can secure, which is the Imperial Council, and if you call for a summit after securing the Imperial Council, you can just say either I'm the first regent or you can say I'm getting out of the empire. So there's this whole like political element that's new as well, which is pretty cool. And I would say it feels political, right? Like, wouldn't you all say that in terms of decision space compared to playing base arcs, this feels like a much more political game?
100%, I think so. And the Imperial Council is a very important card, and the first regent is very important. snatching that at the right time can, mean a bunch of points because there's a bunch of resources on there, or stealing from it, if you're, I mean, we're not talking about future fates yet, but there's reasons why you would want to do that. It's a big deal. And it does, kind of echo Oath and being a citizen in Oath,
Yeah.
where, it's very tug of war over a certain thing, but you're paying someone, but you don't want to be, but you don't want to tax them too much, or they might leave the empire. All kinds of stuff like that. It's great.
Well, and the funny thing about being an outlaw is you wanna be an outlaw because you hate getting taxed. However, as soon as you become an outlaw, you literally put a target on your back because now people actually can fight you, and they can use the Imperial ships to come after you. And so then that sort of, "Hey, we're all on the same team" illusion is, like, completely gone, and you've kinda gotta be ready to defend your positions if you're no longer a scion of the empire. Um, Jared, do you find that you tend to stay in the empire or like do you want to be an outlaw? Like how do you make that decision?
It depends on your fate and the game state. I don't think there is a general rule. It's positional based on how you're going through because as you say, it depends and you don't want to be the only outlaw, but you also don't want to be the only regent. So it's kind of a mix if I were to go as to where the incentives start playing against one another.
Now, uh before we sort of like end the act, I want to talk about uh, how much are you caring about victory points, power, and how much are you caring about your objective? And is there ever a point in Act 1 that you found where you know that you're going to fail your objective and you're in sort of a damage reduction sort of gameplay, right? Like is there a time when you realize you have to pivot or are you like I don't actually care about victory points cuz all I care about is completing these objectives? Like how are you balancing those considerations?
To me, it's while I am still focused on points, I do tend to lead a little bit more on the achievement play, like Jake, and go through where I am very competitive and I'm trying to win, but the difference is the points kind of scale as you go on, so there are a lot more opportunities for points in the later acts, so it is not insurmountable to come back from a lead. But there is an additional incentive to where the winner of an act will be the starting player with the initiative, and we've talked about how important that is throughout, and so just getting that it's another thing to shoot for. So I am always trying to meet my objective while trying to get the most points, and it can sometimes be difficult to balance those things because you it seems like you are more focused on your objective, but later on, you don't want to be doing your objective at the expense of also scoring ambitions and power. You need to juggle those, and it is one of the challenges. And for me, it's also the interesting puzzle of trying to do it.
Arnie, where are you on Act 1 power versus objectives?
Um, I don't know. This is maybe like a sideways answer. I want to do in Act One what is more fun.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that what that essentially means is I want it to get weird. I find a lot of players kind of, and you kind of said this earlier, they kind of treat it like multiplayer solitaire, at least in Act One, right? And I maybe I'm just like naturally fighting against that. My last, or maybe two Act Ones ago, we ended, and all of us only had three ships on the board, and the blight is everywhere, and we all failed. And I was so excited to continue that game because it was just like, what? This is so different and weird. And what's going to happen? Of course, there's going to be a blight sleeker, which is a B faith that likes the blight, And it's just, and kind of the corrupt things with the steward and the believer. I want it to get weird, at least in Act One, because, like Jared said, the consequences are most mitigated in Act One. So if I fail rock hard, I can come back from it in Act Two. And so I am most like chill and having fun. And, that doesn't mean necessarily nice for me because I'm not necessarily nice. So that's how I approach it. Just make it weird, honestly.
Yeah, and just to give, like, listeners, if you haven't played the Blighted Reach, a little bit of how the mechanisms of these objectives work, you have a clock that counts down as you work towards an objective. So, for example, I'm looking at the Overseer card here. And for the overseers, you tick your clock down 3 times every time you use a prelude action on a guild card that discards that card. So now you're like, okay, so I need to acquire guild cards, and then I need to take their prelude actions. And it says you advance twice every time you take the recover action on one of your cards. So then I'm like, okay, then also there's this card in my tableau that I basically get points for using. And so as you play the game, you're trying to tick down that clock and gain points. And at the end of the act, if you failed, you lose points based on how far off you were from ticking your clock all the way down. So you could actually end Act One in negative points. And I've seen it happen. In fact, I think Arnie, the campaign I played with you, you were pretty deep in the negatives at the end of Act One.
No, I think I really bottomed out in Act Two.
Oh, was that Act Two
So
then?
maybe we'll talk about that. But no, we were being friendly to a new player, and so I gave him the first Regency so he didn't have a bad time. And then everybody screwed me, and I failed. So yeah, it happens, and it's not the end of the world. Like, you only really need to worry if you're negative. You can always come back from that, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah,
Well, and these games can go pretty lopsided and you can have like runaway leaders, but at the end of the act, everyone's points are halved. So which means if you did have like a 10-point lead going to the next game, you only have a 5-point lead. And so the game is constantly telling you like, yeah, you should try really hard, but like it's a little bit of a catch-up mechanism, right? We want it to be possible for people to come back.
My latest campaign, 4 players, I got last place in Act 1 and Act 2, and then went on to win the entire thing in Act 3 on points, and everyone was really annoyed with me. So, yes, it is certainly possible to go through as Pete mentioned earlier, there's also the effects of so when you succeed your objective, the game state will change, and if you fail, it will also change, and that will affect everyone, not just you. So that's why people saying sometimes and Arnie made this point earlier, you don't want them to lose because you might know how that will affect you.
So let's
2 other things
okay.
2 other things I
Or you
wanted to
definitely
highlight
want them to
about
lose. Go ahead.
yeah. 2 other things I wanted to highlight about the difference in the campaign and in Act 1 specifically is, there's a completely different court deck, which will have different effects, and you will also shuffle in lore cards based on there. And if you remember from base game arcs and using leaders in lore, lore cannot be stolen. And so that will be carried over through all your acts. And so that means in Act 1, lore has always been very highly contested because you getting an advantage that will carry over through the entire campaign is huge. And then the other long-term characterization is we've discussed outrage, which removes a prelude action that also carries over through each act. And there are some ways to remove it, but they are few and far between. So if it really adds the horizon to the game where making a choice to trigger an outrage or putting yourself in a position where it's a possibility, you really need to be sure because it can be quite punitive to have outrage through for that long of time.
And can I just say, long ramifications like that, if the partisan's in the game, I am gonna, I'm gonna do stuff that's gonna cause outrage. Or if I know in the
For sure.
future that if a fate succeeds, then I don't think the partisan actually lets other people. But there are fates that let you, get out of it. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna have them succeed so that I can get rid of this outrage later. And when you know that stuff, good times. Anyway, let's move on to Act Two.
Yeah, let's end act 1. So, basically the situation is after, act 1 ends, if you, succeeded in your fate, you can continue that A fate into act 2. And usually you have a new objective that is related to your objective in the first game. So, there's a 3-act story with the A Fate. For example, I mentioned to everyone what the advocate was, who is trying to take guild cards. In Act 2, they get objective tick downs for having different suits of guild cards and for having more guild cards than other players. So, you're building on the same concept, right? You're typically touching the same piece of the game you were touching before, but kind of taking it further. That partisan, uh, you can also, like, change the rules of the whole game, like, the partisan, I said, seizes the initiative by outraging, and if they succeed and go on to the 2nd act, that's how everybody now has to seize the initiative. So, sometimes what your special rule was in act 1, if you continue to act 2, that becomes a special rule for everybody. Like, you start to, really start messing with the structure of the game. You add new cards to the court deck. You're like, now it's like consequences are happening. However, you also will get the option to pivot to a B fate. And if you fail at your A fate, you're going to be given 2 B fates to choose from. And even what's funny is that even if you fail your fate's failure impacts the board state of the game. You'll put different cards into the court deck if you fail. And so you actually are telling this like emergent story with cards in the deck in a very cool way. Now, these B fates are way wackier than the A fates. They are typically more disruptive to the rules and state of the game. And maybe the biggest change is that for some of these B fates, like for example, when I one game pivoted to being the hegemon, I then became, someone with a flagship, and you essentially lose your buildings on the board, and instead those buildings go onto a new player board, and now my empire is represented by one giant, like, star destroyer, basically, that is flying around the reach instead of settling on planets. I'm now a single giant flagship with small ships coming in and out of it. Uh, it's crazy.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, how do you feel like bracing that first flagship is when you've already learned so much and there's already so much going on, and then it's like, how about you get this giant, Battlestar Galactica ship,
Yeah.
and every building you build on it gives a little special ability or something, and it's just like, how did this not get cut? I love flagships. They are my favorite fates to play, but what? Yeah, I'm
Well,
glad
and
they
that's
didn't, but it's nuts.
one of the cool things about Blighted Reach here is that they are really, like, taking this system to as many new places as they can. Like, it is thematically so cool. It's like something they're like, "Wow, I didn't kind of realize you could do this." Like, they are willing to, like, throw whole new toys into the toy box in this campaign. And act 2 is where you start to see both how exciting that can be, but also, like, how kind of, like, messy and overwhelming that can be. Because you might have the impact of, you know, 6 different fates all clashing in to create a brand new type of arcs that you've never seen before.
Yeah,
Right.
and that is like, there's 2 things, like, you see the same fates every game, but you don't see the same combination, within your path, and you don't see the same combination with everyone else's path at the same time. And so it really is like it's echoes of a game that you're familiar with, but it's also new. And that is really exciting because, things can still surprise you even when you've played a bunch of games. But at the front end, yeah, it's overwhelming when you're not familiar with it and you read something wrong and you're like, wait, it doesn't work that way. And there's rule checks. So, you know, Blind Reach is a front end, high front end game, but I feel like the rewards just keep stretching out. The honeymoon phase does not stop.
Keeping it spicy in the bedroom the entire
Mm,
time, which
exactly.
is part of the joy of a 3-act campaign. I don't know about you all. I rarely finish campaign games, but the fact that we just have 3 acts to get through means I essentially get to experience probably the amount of craziness of playing through an entire legacy game in 3 sessions of arcs.
What are your
Yes,
guys'
I
experience
really
with
appreciate
campaigns?
the structure.
Yeah, I don't have a good track record of finishing campaign games, right? Like, if we take, like, a little interlude here, like, are you all, like, campaign game players?
I have played quite a few legacy games, but not nearly as
Okay.
many to completion. So I really enjoyed the Clank legacy games. Both of those were terrific.
Mm.
And the Reiner Knizia My City, and then to a much lesser extent, My Island. So not particularly. I'd say the way that uh, Arcs is set up, it reminds me a lot of an older Eric Lang game called Arcadia Quest, where you can play a subset of things, and it's not a legacy game, but it is the campaign. So I never really got into things like Descent or what have you, but I have Arcadia Quest is similar, and so but I do no, I do not play mini campaign games, which is also why I've tried to play Arcs in one fell swoop. So
Huh.
I view it more as one big enormous game than a series because it is difficult to reconvene.
Yeah.
Arnie, where are you with campaign games?
If it's a campaign game, that is like a number one. This is never going to hit the table again. So I avoid campaign games, and I just don't like dungeon crawling and boss battling, and that's typically
Mhm.
where the campaign, lives. And I have played some legacy games, haven't finished them, so I'm kind of on the similar page where it's if it's a campaign, I'm out, and that's kind of a unfortunate failing of Oath that happened to me. So I tried to get it to the table a bunch, but people like new games, and so
It's
the only reason that Arcs the Blighted Reach, hits the table is that it's gonna end. And people
yeah.
know it's gonna end, and we can plan for it to be done. And
Well,
I love that about it.
and something I think is very impressive is like legacy games have a reputation for saying like, "Oh, well, we're going to totally change the game every time you play." However, I think there are more changes act to act in arcs than I have seen over the course of the sort of legacy games I have seen. Like because they know it's only 3 acts, they allow it to kind of go off the rails. And you start to see that in act 2, right? Because they know we can break the game because after act 3 it's over.
Exactly. And just like base arcs on not just like base arcs, but it's swingy. Like it goes for it. I completely agree. And it's going for like big space opera. And if you're, Paul Atreides' father, I'm sorry, you're gonna get axed. And that's like a big thing. And this game echoes that kind of thing where you can like really get crushed, you can really rise, you can come back, all of that. And you're right. They don't hold back because it's gonna end, If Oath did that, then you'd be playing a broken game for a long time, and that'd be no good.
Now, this is also just a 3-chapter game, Act 2, but I don't know about you all. I have found myself towards the end of a second act being almost overwhelmed by the volume of things I have to start paying attention to. Like, especially once that edict booklet starts filling up and I have new rules to internalize. And So there are people with like, you know, up to like 8 or more cards in their tableau, and you're just keep getting more and more and more and more, and it can be a little exhausting. Have you all ever been there in an act 2?
Yes, certainly. As you say, there's a lot of cruft. There's all the things that appeared in the first act that you're still dealing with, the new additions in the second act. So it really does start to build. And even with relatively constraints, I think most of it comes through that additional summit phase. That's been the biggest sticking point in campaigns where it is a little harder to internalize and the flow of how all that interacts. But all that being said, I don't find it insurmountable. Like it does feel like an act 2 where it's the you see the build of the story throughout the chapters. And I made this point during our previous episode, but just their use of language, right? And chapters and acts and arcs, like it really does show that they're giving you the outlines of the story, the sketches, but it's through the player's choices and interactions and the elements of chance that are added into it that really fills out and tells the story. So it's really interesting to see the through line because it's the way the game is structured, like it you are telling the language of the story. It's like, "Oh, I had the admiral failed his objective and left the empire in disgrace, and now he's returned as a pirate lord and now seeking to destroy and steal from the empire that he had previously sworn to protect." And like that, again, as you say, you're not reading a paragraph that tells you that. It emerges through gameplay, and I find that incredibly fascinating and rewarding and worth that the extra rules load that you need to deal with.
Yeah, as far as me for the rules load, I don't start getting overwhelmed until Act 3, so I'm honestly surprised that you said that, and, you know, maybe with the flagship, but I know how flagship works now, so, yeah, I don't know. Act 3,
I
that's where it
I
is.
will say I have also pivoted to a B Fate after succeeding in my A Fate for thematic reasons. Arnie, the game that I played with you, I had a bunch of psionics, and I had played mostly psionics in Act 1. And then in Act 2, I was given pacifist as a potential pivot point. And I was like, well, even though I've been successful, I kind of feel like I'm the pacifist, right? I'm the psionics guy. And so it's kind of funny that like the game enables you to just lean into the theme in a way that base arcs you're purely playing like a tactical points game. And
100%.
you can do more of that role playing here in a way that's very cool.
It's very, very cool, and that's also something I'm glad you pointed that out because I almost forgot, but I love that you can pivot after you succeed. Like you still get one option. So if you fail, you get two options because you have to pivot. If you succeed, and it just kind of all the things that I talked about in Act One, were like if this guy, succeeds and fails and stuff, and then Act Two, like you might be expecting a reach based on what happened in Act One, but because a succeeding player can just be like, nope, I'm the planet breaker now. It just keeps you on your toes, which is just so arcs. Like you can predict, you can see, but you can never know, and then you have to react. And I love that.
J
It's
just to give
love.
people a taste of the theme here, Arnie, you just invoked the Planet Breaker. Uh, can you tell the listeners just, like, how wild are we getting here,
We're
with the Planet
getting
Breaker?
we're getting nuts. So a lot of people I've heard him compared to Thanos, and that's because there's six hammer fragments that are scattered across the reach. You need to go collect them to assemble essentially the world breaking hammer. And at the end of the act, your goal is to blow up a planet. And then
Yes.
we won't talk about future acts, but you continue blowing up planets after that. And
Yeah,
blowing up the
you're assembling a
consequence,
Death Star. It's crazy.
it is 100% a Death Star that looks more like the vacuum from Spaceballs. And I love all of that. Kyle Farron, you're a gem. But there's consequences not just for you. Like it's not just that the planet is gone. Everyone who let you break that planet gets outraged in that resource. So if you break a material planet, everyone's outraged. And then, it introduces some refugees into the core deck that if you, plant them somewhere else, then you can get rid of that outrage. And it's just like, wow, this is just the best game. Anyway,
It
go
almost
ahead.
it feels like they've added an adventure game in the middle of our, like, epic space strategy game, right? It's just so like, you start to see it in Act 2. I think Act 1, you, like, feel that it, like, "Oh, this is kinda cool," but in Act 2, you start to be like, "Whoa, we are, like, in another realm," and people are just like, "We're still playing arcs," and that's the magic of it. Like, we're still seizing initiative, declaring ambitions, and that matters, but what we're doing with that, we've, like, left the realm of anything the base game could imagine.
Yes.
100%.
It's probably too late for spoilers, but yeah, as we've discussed, like the pirate has a treasure map and a hidden hoard of resources, and there's all kinds of different interactions that goes. And like Pete said, like Arcs overall is not super concerned with balance in the fates. It kind of goes where through, but when you choose to continue with your fate, it kind of logically builds on it, so your board position and the things that you've been doing kind of feed into each other, but the B fates are slightly more powerful in some ways, and some of the things that they start with can give you a little bit of boost to bring that element of parity with the other folks that are been playing, but overall so, yeah, so you there are a lot of incentives to continue with your fate and keep building it, but sometimes you wanna choose the fun way and just try new things and see what goes or like Pete said earlier, like, maybe thematically, you just decide this makes more sense for the story that's developing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't just finish up Act 2 here, Arnie, because now I'm gonna start moving us to Act 3.
Jared like invoked so many things right there. So, yes, the fates are not balanced, but I want to be very clear that it's just like root. The balance comes from the table. So like if somebody's got some broken overpowered combo thing, you go in and you take them out, you know. However, in this game because everything's interweaving and changing, figuring out who needs to be bonked is a little more, takes time to figure out. But table balance is where, what makes the game still work even though the fates aren't balanced. And then he said a little bit about and this will tie into your act 3, so don't worry. Um A fates are generally like a whole system, and then as you start to go to B fates, it starts to get a little narrower. But as you said, there's kind of like a restart, but also um the changes that they introduce are often not as big as the A fates will introduce in Act 3. And then even further, when you get to C fates, it is restricted even more. So go ahead and let's jump into Act 3.
Alright, so we're into Act 3 now, right? Act
As
3,
a mission.
you got some people playing A Fates still. They've stuck with it. You got some people who are on the second act of a B Fate, and then the game introduces C Fates, and these C Fates are the most bonkers, game-breaking things that like, beyond anything that those B Fates introduced. Um, so the situation here is if you continue on with an A or B fate, the game presents you what are called grand ambitions, which is essentially new ways to get victory points outside of the ambition system. For example, when I played an Act 3 pacifist, I now could get points after each of the 4 chapters if I had no trophies or captives, and if I had more psionics than all of oh, sorry, if my rivals had more psionics than me. So, all of a sudden in Act 3, I am getting victory points in an escalating way for essentially playing as a pacifist and like spreading peace to my opponents. And, when I played Act 3 Hegemon, I am getting my grand ambition is that no rivals win Tyrant. So either I'm winning Tyrant or no one's winning Tyrant. Or if there are more banners on the board than current chapters, so I'm trying to keep these banners I built on the board. So if you're an A or B fate, you're playing the points game on hyperspeed, right? The game is saying, try and get as many points as you can. And actually, here's some new ways that only you can get points. What are y'all's experiences with these grand ambitions for the A and B fates?
Uh, I'll be honest. I'll be honest, man. The grand ambitions are secondary. You got to worry about the sea fates first.
Okay.
So let's just talk about it.
Okay, great. So these sea fates are have something called a final objective. And essentially, if you have a sea fate, it is possible. It's because you've been getting your butt kicked the entire game. And so, one of the tough things about playing a 3-act campaign of arcs is if I have totally done a horrible job in the first 2 games, do I have to sit through a 3rd game of arcs where I have no chance of winning? And the answer is no, because the sea fates have their own instant win conditions, and you only have to be in the positives in victory points in order to win through one of your final objectives. And these become the thing that everyone at the table worries about, because I may have been the person who's crushing it act 1 and act 2. I've got over a dozen more points than the person in second place. I'm going to coast my way to victory. However, if the overlord is able to um, you know, have planets under their control that they've outraged enough times, then the game just ends and they just win.
How do you
And
feel about it, Pete? How do you feel about
okay, I know you're asking me this, Arnie, because we played a game
uh-huh.
uh, where I had been playing a very strong pacifist game. I've been and then the other person playing with us, Taylor, was on all 3 acts as the caretaker. They've been doing that Gollum lore thing like crazy. And you were losing. And then in comes Arnie, act 3 as the guardian, I believe. And all of a sudden, we can't care about our victory points. We can't care about our objectives. Our entire game becomes stopping the Guardian from doing their weird new, totally new mechanism with these Eden Guard ambition. And it can be a hard pill to swallow. It can be a hard pill to swallow if I've been playing this campaign really well and competitively, and now all of a sudden in the last act, I have to compromise my objectives to stop someone else from completing theirs. It kind of the sea fates kind of make the whole game about them in the end. Is that fair to say?
Um, I think so. I think, that is the design intent, and maybe we can talk a little bit about why. Um, and I think it's pretty obvious what the alternative is that you're playing TI4, at hour 8, and you've got 2 points. And essentially you can king bake somebody. And that's kind of it, right? And it's not fun, and I don't know, it's just something that I don't enjoy. But if you're having a hard time in arcs, like I said, the sea fates are narrower, and they can get stomped sometimes not very difficultly. I think newer players have a hard time with it because they're trying to learn their own fate and they're doing this their own thing. And then all of a sudden, this other person's fate is more important than their fate right now, but they don't realize it until, they've up and won. And um I lost my train. Somebody pick it up.
Jared, do you have any conflicting feelings or do you just enjoy this
So
final objective
so
thing?
this has not been my experience, right? I think the sea fates do change the center of gravity a little bit, and it definitely depends on how many there are, but over my 5 campaigns, there has only been 1 sea fate victory, through their
Yes.
objectives
And in
instantly.
my 4 campaigns, I've seen 2 sea fate final objective wins.
Okay.
Interesting.
And
So
in both of them that I saw the Sea Fate win, they won before the game was over. They won, like, after 2 or 3 chapters, like, we didn't even play the last chapter or 2, and that can happen, and I can see that annoying somebody. I respect the hell out of it, and I think it's cool to give someone that kind of story, and it does create a story for the table, but if you're playing this in, like, the person who does the best at fulfilling their objectives through the campaign will win, you can get the rug pulled out from under you.
yes,
Yeah.
because the other side of that is I have won 2 campaigns with a sea fate through points. So,
Mm.
not through achieving. So, in the example that I played earlier, or I said earlier, I was in last place, failed both of my first objectives, and went into Act 3 as the judge. And the judge wants to force ambition ties to go through there. So, I was trying really hard to force those ties because I was in last place by a significant margin. And believe I was the only sea fate, and so the table was all opposed to me because they did not want to force ties. However, what happened was then I just won those ambitions, and I ended up accruing a lot of points and came from behind to narrowly get the most power and win because I was like, "Okay, if I can't make this a tie, I would make it a win for me." On those ambitions, and so I don't know if it's just player experience or how it goes, but it's so I can definitely see your point, Pete, and it really does change, and you can see if someone has followed their fate all the way through, it goes through, it can be really difficult, and then the other thing that I'll say is I don't like the gate wraith that I find the gate wraith
Okay.
Tell us
quite
about the Gate
annoying.
Wraith, Jared. Tell us about
Yes,
the Gate Wraith.
because all the sea fates change the rules in dramatic ways, but the gate rate specifically creates a black hole in the center of the star system, and now instead of being removed from the board, they all just get sucked into the black hole, and
Yeah,
it
you fight in
it
hell.
creates
It's awesome.
yes, it creates some really crazy interactions, especially because there's still Empire ships out there that so if the Empire controls the one place where every single ship is, it could make for a really strange experience.
All right, Arnie, tell us why you love Sea Fates.
I was telling you why, but then I forgot. So, it's a catch-up mechanism, right? It keeps the players who are struggling, or if the players who want to play the Gate Wraith in the game and mattering. Um, and I think to your point, like you're saying, playing good arcs, um, the whole campaign, and then this guy comes and wins it, and I think you got to recognize when you're going in that to win arcs, you're gonna have to stop somebody in the end. I mean, it might not be a C fate, like it could be a B fate that's a villain. You can't really just be the best at your own thing and get away with it, unless I'm sure there's some games where you're crushing it and somehow you just win it. But honestly, in my experience, there usually is a villain by the end of Act Three, or not the end of Act Three, by Act Three, and the players need to do something about that or they're gonna get squashed by that villain. And I love the table balance and like the trying to do your own objective, but you also have to deal with this thing. And it strings, the trick taking and all the action selection and all the things you're dealing with. It makes it tighter because you have to do more than one thing at once. And honestly, you should be doing that the entire campaign. You should be, not only trying to do your thing, but also try and fail that guy, but you don't have to. In Act 3, you have to. And I freaking love it, but I do think it's an adjustment shift.
Well, there's just the nature of and variety of types of player relationships and interactions throughout a campaign of arcs is crazy because that like I've said many times, the base game is just this tight, tactical, competitive experience. And we're just doing so much different stuff. And it does get kind of overwhelming. I've said it before, but my first campaign of this, we ended up with 3 sea fates. It was one A fate and 3 C fates, and that act 3 was absolutely bonkers. And I went from partisan to overlord because the overlord wants to rule things that they've outraged, and the partisan outrages, like, everything. And it felt like I was just, like, handed an easy win, but it also was everyone's first campaign, so people didn't necessarily know how to stop me. And that's the thing about this campaign is some people are gonna play this because the role-playing thematic element is just, like, this incredible vibesy thing. However, people play competitive Blighted Reach. Like, they have Blighted Reach tournaments. There are strategy guides out there for how to maximize each of these fates. But the amount of investment you have to put in to get to a point to where you feel like you are playing tournament level Blighted Reach is something I don't know if I'll ever get to. It's like the equivalent of probably playing all the Root I've played. The, like, dozens and dozens and dozens of games of Root I've played. That's how much Blighted Reach I feel like I would have to play to even, like, think about being able to make the types of competitive choices in faction mix that I make when I play Root.
And I don't know. Like, I agree with you, but also I guess I'm just a person who just got pulled into that by accident. I don't know. And
I
that's
like the vibesy thing.
I
Like, playing
100% do.
playing fast and loose and vibesy and seeing a story, that's why I'm in the campaign. Right? Jared, you're more of like you've called yourself in this episode, more of an achievement player. Like, you wanna be competitive and win. Like, does the craziness of this campaign, like, challenge you in that way? Now, I know you've won 4 out of your 5 campaigns, but, like, are you going into this for, like, "I'm gonna try and win," or are you gonna go into this because it's like, "I wanna play this story out"?
That's both. Like, I don't think those things are necessarily in conflict for each other. So, my patron saint, Reiner Knizia, right? That classic quote, right? The goal of the game is to win, but it's the goal that's important, not the winning. So I do that. I am really competitive, and that's part of the reason why I get into board games in the first place is like in the game, I'm trying my utmost to win, but then afterwards I could just talk about the cool thing that happened. And Arcs is a type of game where it is it is really easy to just get completely screwed by RNG, right? It can happen. The cards, the dice, what have you, throughout all the different things. And you need to roll with it. And with the Blighted Reach, like it's a commitment, right? It takes 10 to 12 hours to play all 3 acts over how many days if you're going to do it. And you need to be okay with that. So in the game, I am trying to win and I'm focused on that goal, but I I enjoy the experience, right? I enjoy the story that comes out of it, and I appreciate the chance that brings drama out of that. I compare this to one of my other favorite games that I've been playing a lot online lately is called Time of Crisis, about the Roman Empire in turmoil. And so in that game, there are barbarians invading, there are events triggering, and it's dice combat and dice governor placement, right? And so you can just get completely screwed. But I enjoy the arc of the story, right? Seeing these provinces and governors rise and fall and go through. So it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. And for me, like I this is where I thrive, right? The conflict, the drama, the excitement, while letting me, you know, channel my competitive nature into the magic circle safe space of a board game.
Very cool. Does anyone have any last things to say about, like, playing in Act 3 before we shift to sort of, like, final thoughts? Alright.
We talked earlier about how the points go through, so, referencing ambitions, right? So they scale up, and so they get flipped over, so by the end, they're all flipped over, so and then with the grand ambitions, so this is where we say there's a lot of points in play, for there, and it can then go up to 4, or if someone triggers, an instant win. So the scores do normalize a bit by the end. So that's where, as you say, even if you completely screw up in a previous act, it's never impossible to recover through clever choices and clever plays.
Arnie, any more Act 3 thoughts?
I don't think so. Other than I think it's great. I
How about
think
this? Do you
that
all have a favorite act?
oh man. Hold on. I gotta answer your original question. You
Okay,
can think
sorry.
on that,
Oh.
Jared. Um, I don't know. For me, kind of on the competitiveness, I feel like once you start knowing all the paths and all that kind of thing, it's just like four times the route that route is,
Mhm.
and like twice the oath is, and it's also like twice the arcs that Artsy is. Once you under once you know all the possibilities, you start to feel like Paul Atreides. You're trying to manipulate it in your favor. And I just love trying to get Act 3 to be what I want it to be beyond just my fate. And is that something that's easily achievable? No, you're working with your action cards and like, what everybody else is doing, but I love trying to play the whole game as if it's for the Act 3. And as far as my favorite act, I honestly think it's 1 because I like making it weird because that's when it's, the least competitive. And then, probably act 2 and then act 3 is for all the marbles, so it's really stressful and there's a lot of stuff going on. So, I think it's in the order that they come in that I like them the most, which is ironic because,
Well, what
act
that
3
tells me,
is what I'm
Arnie,
playing for.
you like seeing the ripples of the consequences of your decisions, right? You like seeing how people's decisions tell the story, and how like those successes and failures like create weird ways to play arcs. When Act 3 is over, you can't play more arcs. You start over, right? Like you
Mhm.
like, yeah. So that totally makes sense to me.
And I think it's more than just like kind of like you said earlier, like because the fates changed the rules, like you're changing the environment that even exists of the game that you're playing. Like, does that
It's
make any sense?
Yeah, it's exciting to think that like on your 20th campaign, you could see a game state in arcs that you've never seen before,
100%,
right?
100%.
Like on your 50th campaign, you might be like, "Wow, I've never seen this arcs before." And like that's this almost like roguelike sort of experience, right? You're getting like all the sort of like random, it's not procedural generation, it's player decisions, but it's essentially setting up arcs and you're like, "Wow, I kind of have never seen this arcs." And that's just so exciting.
Right. And the Blight Speaker comes to mind because they're actually like a pretty hard, tricky fate to pilot. And they're essentially little shock of horrors. In Act 3, they want the Blight to eat your ships. That's their goal. And, I saw them a few times come up and they just kind of petered out. And I was like, okay, that's not like a super exciting thing. But then when you see it in the hands of an expert and it's like firing off and it's a horror show and it's like the flood from Halo, that's a different arcs, even though it was the same fate, because it was how the players chose to play it, made it a different arcs. And it's so good. Go ahead, Jared. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's terrific. I don't have a favorite act necessarily because I do view the campaign as all one thing. I don't know if we really covered this, but just I also give a lot of props to Leader and Barry Giant just about the structure because the save game state is really well executed. Like I have done a multi-day campaign on one of them, and it was really impressive for it to jump back in and get it set up and everyone was able to go back in. However, I I view it as a single campaign, and so I like all the acts. I think I would agree with Arnie where I like the beginning, the kind of fresh possibilities of Act 1, but I I I view it as one story, personally.
What about you, Pete?
Yeah, so having never done it all as one, I do see them as distinct acts, and, it's kind of interesting because, like, Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars movie, and there's something about that middle act that's so special because you're both experiencing the impact of the first game, but then also know that you're setting up another game, and there's something so special about being in the middle of a three-act structure, and I think this game kind of captures that, right? There's something special about, you know Empire Strikes Back or The Dark Knight or whatever, right? That the middle of the 3-act campaign is when you both are experiencing consequences and also, like, setting up, like, hope. Like, even if you lose, you're like, "Well, I have hope." And it's kind of a neat experience to be like, "I'm partially a victim of circumstance and choice, but no matter what, there's hope." And, like, sorry, I'm getting, like, poetic here, but, like, there's just
No,
something so cool about that.
Yeah, that's a really neat perspective.
I like the Act Two because of those are all my favorite phases, to be honest. The
Oh, the
flagship
B
phase,
fates are your favorite fates?
yeah, Hegemon, Pirate, Planet Breaker, Blight Speaker. Let's go. Those are my
Yeah.
favorites. So, yeah,
Awesome.
I
Well
completely agree with you though. Empire Strikes Back is the best.
I mean, that's not even up for debate, but I
100%.
mean,
100%.
I'm gonna be vulnerable here and say that I'm not a Last Jedi hater as well, so,
I'm not
Oh,
either. I do have
alright.
other things about Star Wars. I think it's inevitable now, but
Yeah.
not the Last
W
Jedi. I'm okay with that.
we won't get into it.
Don't get
Do
it.
you all have any, like, final thoughts? Because 'Cause we've been kinda going on and on and on. Do you have any, like, sort of, like, quick, like, last word that you'd like to throw out there about the Blighted Reach?
Well, I'm curious as to where where this falls for you guys in comparison to the Whirly verse. How does it
Hmm.
rank for you? How do you feel about it overall, in comparison to other things?
Jared, do you wanna
So,
start?
yes, Pete and I discussed in that first episode. So, I for me, the campaign is what Arcs is, right? I appreciate the base game. I'll happily play it, but when I play Arcs, like, I want to make a whole day of it. I want to play the campaign. I want to really get into it. And this is my favorite Cole Worley game, and it's in my top 10 favorite games overall. I love the campaign. It's my favorite, uh, not a space conflict game in this kind of space opera game, and I find it incredibly rewarding, satisfying, challenging, all these adjectives to describe it. So this is the type of thing that I want to be doing on my table with my friends.
So for me, I would actually say I like Blighted Reach as much as I like base arcs. And that's not an insult to Blighted Reach. I just really love playing base arcs. Like it's giving me a totally different kind of experience, honestly. But in terms of the Whirly Pantheon, I think I talked about this in the first episode. Like John Company and arcs, and I'm putting all arcs on an equal playing field for me. John Company and arcs are sort of tied for second for me and Root is at the top, and maybe that's in part because of the number of Root games I've played or what it's meant to me in the hobby, but, like, I think that throwing a mix of Root factions in is giving me, in about an hour, about 60 to 70% of what I love about playing Blighted Reach Arcs, and so it's just such a condensed version of this, like, watch a bunch of stuff collide in ways you've never seen. And so it's just below Root for me and kind of on par with John Company. And I think that both Arcs and John Company are games that are creating incredibly memorable tabletop experiences. And that's what I want from a game. And, I've played 4 Arcs campaigns and I can basically tell you the story of those 4 campaigns. That's what it's doing for me.
And how long ago, was your first campaign? Because I
It was
feel
like
similarly. Yeah.
right after it came out. Yeah.
Wow. And you remember it. That's just board games can be so cool. Um, so my favorite is John Company. And that's because I like the wheeling and dealing. Like there's some of that in Arcs, and I kind of, maybe that's why I complain about people not engaging with the summits. But um it's just executed so beautifully in John Company. But right behind that is Light of Reach. And I think it's interesting that Root used to be my favorite game. And I think you kind of pulled out something that is true, that the Blighted Reach has the future impacts that, you were talking about, and that I love. And I love stringing those consequences, through a longer thing, and you just can't do that in Root. And I like, base arcs, how smooth and, the trick taking. I like how the actions work more in base arcs than I do in Root. Even though Root is still just like a giant and I still love it, but I don't know, it's fallen a little bit. Um so I
You
guess
just
I'm
listen,
just a
t
monster.
tisk tisk, but that's
Just is.
I
well,
just played Root 2 days ago.
I'm still
Yeah,
waiting for my
we got that
Root
new
expansion to come
homeland.
in.
Yeah,
Right. Um,
jolt
Homeland is
of
gonna come
adrenaline.
before I get the base game back, and that's very frustrating.
so if you're someone who's only played base arcs and you're trying to decide whether Blighted Reach is for you, here's what I would say. I would say if what you are annoyed by is the sort of like unfairness of the card draw and dice rolls, Blighted Reach will only exacerbate those annoyances because Blighted Reach tells you objectives that then maybe RNG is going to hurt. You don't even get to choose your objective. So I would say if the quote unquote unfairness of the system bothers you, Blighted Reach is not probably going to fix that. However, if what you enjoy is the core mechanisms and you've seen those leaders in lore and been like, "Ooh, I like the asymmetry this brings," then it's going to, I think, be worth what you put into it. And I think that if you like the theme of arcs, then Kyle Farron's artwork and the thematic work done in the campaign is beyond anything in the base game. But it's just gonna get messy, right? It's gonna be messy, and you've gotta sort of like embrace the mess. And if you play it enough, you're gonna kind of learn how to like surf the waves instead of drowning, right?
100%. 100%. I feel like the thing that I like most about arcs is trying to figure it out. And if that's what you like about base arcs, trying to figure it out in the Blighted Reach is so much harder, and therefore for me so much more satisfying.
Awesome. Jared and Arnie, thank you so much for joining me. I'm gonna wrap up this episode. We got kind of, we got kind of poetic about this big space dice chucker, and I think if nothing else, that says something about the quality of this game. So thank you both of you for joining me for this. Uh, Also, I just should say that if you're listening to this when it drops, that there's still a few days left on a crowdfunding campaign for more arcs, which I'm sure Jared and Arnie, you all are just like, please, please, please just inject more fates into my veins, right?
100%.
I'm
Exactly.
excited though that they're adding some stuff that takes some of the wildness of Blighted Reach and importing it into the base game. I think that's going to be something I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of.
All of it just looks
Yes.
so great. Love it.
Awesome.
Yep.
So
Looking forward to part 3 of this episode recording when the new content arrives.
in 2028 there will be another one of these. So
Ah, yeah.
anyway, thanks everyone for listening. If you want to talk about Blighted Reach, we're gonna have a channel in our Discord where we talk about the episode. We'd love to hear your stories. Like, I actually have a narrative I wrote for one of my games. Maybe I'll share that in the Discord. So let's get into it. Thanks for listening. We've also got a Patreon if you want to support the show. And thanks as always to Hembre for the use of their song Reach Out as our intro and outro song. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.